Jesus is about 30 years old when this event happens. The last time we heard about him was when he was 12, and he and his folks went down to Jerusalem for the blessings, and he wandered off and got lost for a few days. So, and before that, we don't know much about what his life was either. So we just don't know what kind of a life Jesus had up to this point. In the gospel, the word that they use when they talk about Jesus is they say, we translate it by saying he was a carpenter, but the word they use says he was an artisan, which is more than just hammer and nails, but does artistic things. But that's all we know. We don't know. Now, he's up in Galilee, which is in the north part of the country, up above the Sea of Galilee. And he comes down to Jericho, which is where John is, right outside of Jericho, on the Jordan River, just before it goes into the Dead Sea. Now, again, John is Jesus' cousin. John's 6 months older than him. Now, what kind of relationship or friendship they had during all these 30 years, we have absolutely no information. We do a lot of guessing, but there is no information. So Jesus hears about John preaching, and Jesus is clear up in Galilee, and so he decides to come down and see what's going on. And he comes and he spends some time, whether it was an hour or a day or a month, listening to Jesus and listening to John preach, and he decides to be baptized. And he is. And the heavens are torn open, and Jesus is overwhelmed and doesn't know what to do. This absolutely blew him away. So he goes off to the desert, which is all of 10 miles away, and he spends 40 days by himself, fasting and praying. God, what was this all about? And that's where he's tempted by the devil, and we've got that story later on. Then after those 40 days, Jesus heads back up to Galilee, and he begins his preaching. Now, his preaching is, if you listen to the first reading, is about bringing in the sick and fixing things, but feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, welcoming the foreigner. Come in, sit down, have something to eat. Eating with your usual enemies, tax collectors. How many of you sit down to eat with your tax collector, huh? But Jesus did. His whole message and teaching is about love and caring. And when the kids come in, he grabs them, gives them a hug, and welcomes them. Everything about Jesus is welcoming. There is no violence, no force ever used by Jesus. Nowhere. As Jesus is being arrested by the soldiers from the temple and whatever other soldiers, and Peter sees what's going on, and Peter grabs his sword and swings at those guys that are coming after him and cuts the ear off of one of them, and Jesus says, "Stop, Peter, put it away." And Jesus repairs the man's ear so the man can arrest him. Wow. Would any of us do that? But that's what Jesus does. And then we had in Washington, D.C. this past week, the violence that was there. That is not the gospel. That is not Jesus' teaching. Jesus does not teach us to grab our guns and go in and threaten people. That's not how Jesus does anything. One of our problems as human beings is that when we learn something, then we think, boy, I got the absolute truth. I know how things are. Well, wait a minute. Only God knows that, huh? Only God knows absolute truth. All I have is what I know at the moment until I learn something more in the next hour or tomorrow or next year. Somebody comes in and says, hey, there's more to that than this. Have you ever thought of? Oh, I learned some more stuff. I didn't know it before. Well, when we start thinking that we know it and know it all and we got the truth, then that leads to violence and force. And we need to remember that only God has got the truth, absolutely. What I got is what I got at the moment. And maybe I need to sit down with you and have a cup of coffee and listen to what you got to teach me. Might be something I need to know. You bring the guns in, I'm not going to listen to you. Guns don't bring truth. Guns don't bring justice. Love does. And one of the most important parts that all of us have to learn is that we need to listen. Be open to learning. Get off of our crazy horse of absolute truth and understand that what I know for the moment. And next week or next month or next year, I'm going to have to learn some new stuff. And you may be the one to teach me. And instead of you bringing your guns and me pulling out my guns, or like Peter grabbing my sword,